Jazz, musical style and genre. Jazz is a music genre that originated in the African American communities of New Orleans, Louisiana, United States, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with its roots in blues and ragtime. Since the 1920s jazz age, it has been recognized as major form of musical expression in traditional and popular music, linked by the common bonds of African American and European American musical parentage. Jazz is characterized by swing and blues notes, complex chords, call and response vocals, polyrhythms, and improvisation. Jazz has roots in West African cultural musical expression and in African American music traditions. As jazz spread around the world, it drew on national, regional, and local musical cultures, which gave rise to different styles. New Orleans jazz began in the early 1910s, combining earlier brass band marches, French quadrilles, biguine, ragtime, and blues with collective polyphonic improvisation. In the 1930s, heavily arranged dance-oriented swing big bands, Kansas City jazz, and hard-swinging bluesy improvisational style and gypsy jazz were the prominent styles. Bebop emerged in the 1940s, shifting jazz from danceable popular music toward a more challenging musician's music, which was played at faster tempos and used more chord-based improvisation. Cool jazz developed near the end of 1940s, introducing calmer, smoother sounds and long linear melodic lines. The mid-1950s saw the emergence of hard bop, which introduced influences from rhythm and blues, gospel and blues, especially in the saxophone and piano playing. Modal jazz developed in the late 1950s using the mode or musical scale as the basis of musical structure and improvisation, as did free jazz, which explored playing without regular meter, beat, or formal structures. Jazz rock fusion appeared in the late 1960s and early 1970s, combining jazz improvisation with rock music's rhythm, electric instruments, and highly amplified stage sound. In the early 1980s, a commercial form of jazz fusion called smooth jazz became successful, garnering significant radio airplay. Other styles and genres around in the 2000s, such as Latin and African. Other styles and genres abound in the 2000s, such as Latin and AfroCuban jazz. Etymology and definition. American jazz composer, lyricist, and pianist U.B. Blake made an early contribution to the genre's etymology. The origin of the word jazz has resulted in considerable research, and its history is well documented. It is believed to be related to jazzum, a slang term dating back to 1860 meaning pep energy. The earliest written record of the word is in a 1920 article in the Los Angeles Times, in which a minor league baseball pitcher described a pitch which he called a jazz ball because it wobbles and you simply can't do anything with it. The use of the word in a musical context was documented as early as 1915 in the Chicago Daily Tribune. Its first documented use in a musical context in New Orleans was in a November 14, 1960 Times Picayune article about jazz bands. In an interview with National Public Radio, musician U.B. Blake offered his recollections of the slang connotations of the term, saying, when Broadway picked it up, they called it J-A-S-Z-Z. It wasn't called that, it was spelled J-A-S-S. That was dirty. And if you knew what it was, you wouldn't say it in front of ladies. The American Dialect Society named it the word of the 20th century. Jazz is difficult to define because it encompasses a wide range of music spanning a period of over 100 years, from ragtime to the rock-infused fusion. Attempts have been made to define jazz from the perspective of other musical traditions such as European music history or African music. But critic Joachim Ernst Berendt argues that its terms of reference and its definition should be broader, defining jazz as a form of art music which originated in the United States through the confrontation of the Negro with European music, and arguing that it differs from European music in that jazz has a special relationship to time defined as swing. Jazz involves a spontaneity and vitality of musical production in which improvisation plays a role and contains a sonority and manner of phrasing which mirror the individuality of the performing jazz musician. In the opinion of Robert Christgau, most of us would say that inventing meaning while letting loose is the essence and promise of jazz. A broader definition that encompasses different eras of jazz has been proposed by Travis Jackson. It is music that includes qualities such as swing, improvising, group interaction, developing an individual voice, and being open to different musical possibilities. Corinne Gibbard argues that jazz is a construct which designates a number of musics with enough in common to be understood as part of a coherent tradition. In contrast to commentators who have argued for excluding types of jazz, musicians are sometimes reluctant to define the music they play. And Duke Ellington, one of jazz's most famous figures, said, "It's all music." Elements and issues, improvisation. Although jazz is considered difficult to define, in part because it contains many subgenres, improvisation is one of its defining elements. The centrality of improvisation is attributed to the influence of earlier forms of music such as blues, a form of folk music which arose in part from the work songs and field hollers of African American slaves on plantations. These work songs were commonly structured around a repetitive call and response pattern, but early blues was also improvisational. Classical music performance is evaluated more by its fidelity to the musical score, with less attention given to interpretation, ornamentation, and accompaniment. The classical performer's goal is to play the composition as it was written. In contrast, jazz is often characterized by the product of interaction and collaboration, placing less value on the contribution of the composer, if there is one, and more on the performer. The jazz performer interprets a tune in individual ways, never playing the same composition twice. Depending on the performer's mood, experience, and interaction with band members or audience members, the performer may change melodies, harmonies, and time signatures. In early Dixieland, also known as New Orleans jazz, performers took turns playing melodies and improvising counter melodies. In the swing era of the 1920s to 1940s, big bands relied more on arrangements which were written or learned by ear and memorized. Soloists improvised with these arrangements. In the bebop era of the 1940s, big bands gave way to small groups and minimal arrangements in which the melody was stated briefly at the beginning and most of the piece was improvised. Modal jazz abandoned chord progressions to allow musicians to improvise even more. In many forms of jazz, a soloist is supported by a rhythm section of one or more chordal instruments, piano, guitar, double bass, and drums. The rhythm section plays chords and rhythms that outline the composition structure and complement the soloist. In avant-garde and free jazz, the separation of soloist and band is reduced, and there's license or even a requirement for the abandoning of chords, scales, and meters. Traditionalism. Since the emergence of bebop, forms of jazz that are commercially oriented or influenced by popular music has been criticized. According to Bruce Johnson, there has always been a tension between jazz as a commercial music and an art form. Traditional jazz enthusiasts have dismissed bebop, free jazz, and jazz fusion as forms of debasement and betrayal. An alternative view is that jazz can absorb and transform diverse musical styles. By avoiding the creation of norms, jazz allows avant garde styles to emerge. Jazz and race. For some African Americans, jazz has drawn attention to African American contributions to culture and history. For others, jazz is a reminder of an oppressive and racist society and, and restrictions on their artistic visions. Amiri Baraka argues that there is a white jazz genre that expresses whiteness. White jazz musicians appeared in the Midwest and in other areas throughout the U.S. Papa Jack Lane, who ran the Reliance Band in New Orleans in the 1910s, was called the father of white jazz. The original Dixieland Jazz Band, whose members were white, were the first jazz group to record, and Bix Beiderbecke was one of the most prominent jazz soloists of the 1920s. The Chicago style was developed by white musicians such as Eddie Condon, Bud Freeman, Jimmy McParland, and Dave Tough. Others from Chicago, such as Benny Goodman and Gene Krupa, became leading members of swing during the 1930s. Many bands, including both black and white musicians. These musicians helped change attitudes towards race in the United States. Roles of women. Ethel Waters sang Stormy Weather at the Cotton Club. Female jazz performers and composers have contributed to jazz throughout its history. Although Betty Carter, Ella Fitzgerald, Adelaide Hall, Billie Holiday, Abby Lincoln, Anita O'Day, Diane Washington, and Ethel Waters were recognized for their vocal talent, less familiar were band leaders, composers, and instrumentalists such as pianist Lil Hardin Armstrong, trumpeter Valeda Snow, and songwriters Irene Higginbotham and Dorothy Fields. Women began playing instruments in jazz in the early 1920s, drawing particular recognition on piano. When male jazz musicians were drafted during World War II, many all-female bands replaced them. The International Sweethearts of Rhythms, which was founded in 1937, was a popular band that became the first all-female integrated band in the U.S. and the first to travel with the USO, touring Europe in 1945. Women were members of the big bands of Woody Herman and Gerald Wilson. Beginning in the 1950s, many women jazz instrumentalists were prominent, some sustaining long careers. Some of the most distinctive improvisers, composers, and band leaders in jazz have been women. Trombonist Melba Liston is acknowledged as the first female horn player to work in major bands and to make a real impact on jazz, not only as a musician but also as a respected composer and arranger, particularly through her collaborations with Randy Weston from the late 1950s into 1990s. Origins and early history. Jazz originated in the late 19th to early 20th century as interpretations of American and European classical music entwined with African and slave folk songs and the influences of West African culture. Its composition and style have changed many times throughout the years, with each performer's personal interpretation and improvisation, which is also one of the greatest appeals of the genre. Blended African and European music sensibilities. Dance in Congo Square in the late 1970s artist conception by E. W. Campbell from a century later. In the late 18th century painting, the old plantation African Americans danced to banjo and percussion. By the 18th century, slaves in the New Orleans area gathered socially at a special market in an area which later became known as the Congo Square, famous for its African dances. By 1866, the Atlantic slave trade had brought nearly 400,000 Africans to North America. The slaves came largely from West Africa and the greater Congo River basin and brought strong musical traditions with them. The African traditions primarily use a single line melody and call and response pattern, and the rhythms have a counter metric structure and reflect African speech patterns. In 1885, a account says that they were making strange music, Creole, on an equally strange variety of instruments, washboards, wash tubs, jugs, boxes beaten with sticks or bones, and a drum made by stretching skin over a flour barrel. Lavish festivals with African-based dances to drums were organized on Sundays at Place Congo, or Congo Square, in New Orleans until 1843. There are historical accounts of other music and dance gatherings elsewhere in the southern United States. Another influence came from the harmonic style of hymns of the church, which black slaves had learned and incorporated into their own music as spirituals. The origins of the blues are undocumented, though they can be seen as a secular counterpart of the spirituals. However, as Gerald Kubik points out, whereas the spirituals are homophonic, rural blues and early jazz was largely based on concepts of heterophony. The Black-Faced Virginia Minstrels in 1843 featuring tambourine, fiddle, banjo, and bones. During the early 19th century, an increasing number of black musicians learned to play European instruments, particularly the violin, which they used to parody European dance music in their own cakewalk dances. In turn, European American minstrel show performance in blackface popularized the music internationally, combining syncopation with European harmonic accompaniment. In the mid-1800s, the white New Orleans composer Louis Gottschalk adapted slave rhythms and melodies from Cuba and other Caribbean islands into piano salon music. New Orleans was the main nexus between the Afro-Cuban and African American culture. African rhythm retention. The Black Codes outlawed drumming by slaves, which meant that African drumming traditions were not preserved in North America, unlike in Cuba, Haiti, and elsewhere in the Caribbean. African-based rhythmic patterns were retained in the United States in large part through body rhythms such as stomping, clapping, and patting juba dancing. In the opinion of jazz historian Ernest Bornemann, what preceded New Orleans jazz before 1890 was Afro-Latin music, similar to what was played in the Caribbean at the time. A three-stroke pattern known in Cuban music as tresillo is the fundamental rhythm figure heard in many different slaves' music of the Caribbean, as well as the African Caribbean folk dances performed in New Orleans, Congo Square, and Gottschalk's compositions. Tresillo is the most basic and most prevalent double pulse rhythmic cell in sub-Saharan African music tradition and the music of the African diaspora. Tresillo is heard prominently in New Orleans second-line music and in other forms of popular music from that city from the turn of the 20th century to present. By and large, the simpler African rhythmic patterns survived in jazz because they could be adapted more readily to European rhythmic conceptions, jazz historian Gunther Schuller observed. Some survived, others were discarded as the Europeanization progressed. In the post Civil War period, African Americans were able to obtain surplus military bass drums, snare drums, and fifes, and an original African American drum and five music emerged, featuring tricillo and related syncopated rhythmic figures. This was a drumming tradition that was distinct from its Caribbean counterparts, expressing a uniquely African American sensibility. The snare and bass drummers played syncopated cross rhythms, observed the writer Robert Palmer, speculating that this tradition must have dated back to the la- latter half of the 19th century. It could have not have developed in the first place if there hadn't been a reservoir of polyrhythmic sophistication in the culture it nurtured. Afro-Cuban influence. African American music began incorporating Afro-Cuban rhythmic motifs in the 19th century when the habanera gained international popularity. Musicians from Havana and New Orleans would take the twice daily ferry between both cities to perform, and the habanera quickly took root in the musically fertile Crescent City. John Storm Roberts stated that the musical genre habanera reached the US 20 years before the first rag was published. For the more than quarter century in which the cakewalk, ragtime, and proto jazz were formed and developing, the habanera was a consistent part of African American popular music. Habaneras were widely available as sheet music and were the first rhythm music was rhythmically based on an African motive. From the perspective of African American music, the habanera rhythm, also known as Congo, Congo, or tango, can be thought of as a combination of tricillo and the backbeat. The habanera was the first of many Cuban music genres which enjoyed periods of popularity in the United States and reinforced and inspired the use of tricillo-based rhythms in African American music. New Orleans native Louis Murakatchuk's piano piece, Ojos Criollos, was influenced by the composer's studies in Cuba. Ragtime. Scott Joplin in 1903. The abolition of slavery in 1865 led to new opportunities for the education of freed African Americans. Although strict segregation limited employment opportunities for most blacks, many were able to find work in entertainment. Black musicians were able to provide entertainment in dances, minstrel shows, and vaudeville, during which time many marching bands were formed. Black pianists played in bars, clubs, and brothels as ragtime developed. Ragtime appeared as sheet music, popularized by African American musicians such as the entertainer Ernest Hogan, whose hit songs appeared in 1895. 2 years later, Wes Osman recorded a medley of these songs as a banjo solo known as Ragtime Medley. Also in 1897, the white composer William Krell published his Mississippi Rag as the first written piano instrumental ragtime piece, and Tom Turpin published his Harlem Rag, the first rag published by an African American. Classically trained pianist Scott Joplin produced his original rags in 1898 and in 1899 had an international hit with Maple Leaf Rag, a multi-strain ragtime march with four parts that feature recurring themes and a bass line with copious seventh chords. Its structure was the basis for many other rags, and the syncopations in the right hand, especially in the transition between the first and second strain, were novel at the time. African-based rhythmic patterns such as tricillo and its variants, habanera rhythm and cinquillo, are heard in the ragtime compositions of Joplin and Tarpon. Joplin's solos is generally considered to be in the habanera genre, but of the pianist's hands play in a syncopated fashion, completely abandoning any sense of a marked rhythm. Ned Sadelet postulates that the Silo habanero rhythm found its way into ragtime and the cakewalk, whilst Roberts suggests that the habanero influence may have been part of what freed black music from ragtime European bass. Blues, African genesis. Blues is the name given to both a musical form and a musical genre, which originated in African American communities of primarily the deep south of the United States at the end of the 19th century, from their spirituals, work songs, field hollers, shouts, and chants, and rhythm and rhyme simple narrative ballads. The African use of pentatonic scales contributed to the development of blues notes in blues and jazz. W. C. Handy at 1892. W. C. Handy became interested in folk blues of the Deep South while traveling through the Mississippi Delta. In this folk blues form, the singer would improvise freely within a limited melodic range, sounding like a field holler, and the guitar accompaniment was slapped rather than strummed like a small drum which responded in syncopated accents functioning as another voice. Handy and his band members were formally trained African American musicians who had not grown up with the blues, yet he was able to adapt the blues to a larger band instrument format and arrange them in popular music form. The publication of his Memphis Blues sheet music in 1912 introduced the 12-bar blues to the world, although Gunther Schuller argues that it is not really a blues but more like a cakewalk. This composition, as well as his later St. Louis Blues and others, included the habanero rhythm and would become jazz standards. Handy's music career began in the pre-jazz era and contributed to the codification of jazz through the publication of some of the first jazz sheet music. New Orleans, the Bolden Band around 1905. The music of New Orleans had a profound effect on the creation of early jazz. In New Orleans, slaves could practice elements of their culture such as voodoo and playing drums. Many early jazz musicians played in the bars and brothels of the red light district around Basin Street called Storyville. In addition to dance bands, there were marching bands which played at lavish funerals, later called jazz funerals. The instruments used by marching bands and dance bands became the instruments of jazz: brass, drums, and reeds tuned in the European 12-tone scale. Small bands contain a combination of self-taught and formally educated musicians, many from the funeral procession tradition. These bands traveled in black communities in the Deep South. Beginning in 1914, Creole and African American musicians played in vaudeville shows which carried jazz to cities in the northern and western parts of the U.S. In New Orleans, a white bandleader named Papa Jack Lane integrated blacks and whites in his marching band. He was known as the father of white jazz because of the many top players he employed, such as George Bruns, Sharkey Bonanno, and future members of the original Dixieland Jazz Band. During the early 1900s, jazz was mostly performed in African American and mulatto communities due to segregation laws. Storyville brought jazz to a wider audience through tourists who visited the port city of New Orleans. Many jazz musicians from African American communities were hired to perform in bars and brothels. This included Buddy Bolden and Jelly Roll Morton, in addition to those from other communities such as Lorenzo Tio and Alcide Nunez. Louis Armstrong started his career in Storyville and found success in Chicago. Storyville was shut down in the U.S. government in 1917. Syncopation. Jelly Roll Morton in Los Angeles, California, circa 1917 or 1918. Cornet is Buddy Bolden played in New Orleans from 1895 to 1906. No recordings by him exist. His band is credited with creating the Big Four, the first syncopated bass drum pattern to deviate from the standard on the beat march. Afro-Creole pianist Jelly Roll Morton began his career in Storyville. Beginning in 1904, he toured with vaudeville shows to southern cities, Chicago and New York City. In 1905, he composed Jelly Roll Blues, which became the first jazz arrangement in print when it was published in 1915. It introduced more musicians to the Orleans style. Morton considered the Tresillo Habanera, which he called the Spanish tinge, an essential ingredient of jazz. Now, in one of my earliest tunes, New Orleans Blues, you can notice the Spanish ting. In fact, you can't manage to put tinge in Spanish in your tunes. You will never be able to get the right seasoning. I call it for jazz, he said. Morton was a crucial innovator in the evolution from the early jazz from known as ragtime to jazz piano, and could perform pieces in either style. In 1938, Morton made a series of recordings for the Library of Congress in which he demonstrated the difference between the two styles. Morton's solos, however, were still close to ragtime and were not merely improvisations over chord changes as in later jazz, but his use of the blues was in equal importance. Swing in the early 20th century. Morton loosened ragtime's rigid rhythmic feeling, decreasing its embellishments and employing a swing feeling. Swing is the most important and enduring African-based rhythmic technique used in jazz. An often quoted definition of swing by Louis Armstrong is, "If you don't feel it, you'll never know it." The New Harvard Dictionary of Music states that swing is an intangible rhythmic momentum in jazz. Swing defies analysis. Claims to its presence may inspire arguments. The dictionary does nonetheless provide a useful description of triple subdivisions of the beat contrasted with tuple subdivisions. Swing superimposes 6 subdivisions of the beat over a basic pulse structure or 4 subdivisions. This aspect of swing is far more prevalent in African American music than in Afro-Caribbean music. One aspect of swing, which is heard in more rhythmically complex diaspora musics, places strokes in between the triple and double pulse grids. New Orleans brass bands are a lasting influence, contributing horn players to the world of professional jazz with the distinct sound of the city whilst helping black children escape poverty. The leader of New Orleans Camilla Brass Band, the Yalma Gainiers, taught Louis Armstrong to play trumpet. Armstrong would then popularize the New Orleans style of trumpet playing and then expand it. Like Jelly Roll Morton, Armstrong is also credited with the abandonment of ragtime's stiffness in favor of swung notes. Armstrong, perhaps more than any other musician, codified the rhythmic technique of swing in jazz and broadened the jazz solo vocabulary. The original Dixieland Jazz Band made the music's first recordings early in 1917, and their Livery Stable Blues became the earliest released jazz record. That year, numerous other bands made recordings featuring jazz in the title or band name, but most were ragtime or novelty records rather than jazz. In February 1918, during World War I, James Rees, Europe's Hellfighter Infantry band, took ragtime to Europe. Then, on their return recorded Dixieland standards, including Darktown Strategy Balls.